January 12, 1945. The frozen mud of Bavaria crunched beneath Lieutenant James Crawford's boots as he stumbled through the gates of Stalag VII-A, just outside Munich. His hands were bound loosely with fraying rope, his uniform hung in tatters, and his ribs pressed against his skin like piano keys waiting to be played. He'd been shot down over the Ruhr Valley 3 weeks earlier, his B-17 disintegrating around him in a shower of metal and fire. The parachute descent had been a blur of terror and relief, the landing a brutal collision with German soil. Now, after days of interrogation and transport in cattle cars, he'd arrived at what he assumed would be his tomb. Crawford had heard the stories. Every American airman had. German POW camps were death factories where men withered to skeletons, where guards beat prisoners for sport, where a slow, agonizing starvation waited for anyone unlucky enough to survive the initial brutality. He'd made his peace with it during the long, dark journey. At 24 years old, Lieutenant James Crawford expected to die in Germany. What he didn't expect was what happened next. The guard who processed him at the intake building was old, impossibly old for a soldier. His Wehrmacht uniform hung loose on a frame that had clearly once been more substantial. Deep lines carved canyons across his face, and his eyes held a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. His name tag read Fisher, and his hands trembled slightly as he filled out Crawford's prisoner card. Fisher spoke broken English, halting and careful. "Welcome to Stalag VII-A," he said quietly, almost apologetically. "You will be in Compound C, Building 14. His voice dropped lower, barely a whisper. "It is not good here. But we do what we can." Crawford didn't understand. Not then. He was marched across the sprawling camp, past rows of identical wooden barracks that stretched toward the horizon like tombstones in a military cemetery. The camp held thousands of prisoners, British, French, Soviet, and now American. The January wind cut through his thin uniform like razors made of ice. Everything was gray, the sky, the buildings, the faces of the men who watched him pass with hollow eyes. Building 14 was a long, low structure that smelled of unwashed bodies, damp wood, and despair. Inside, triple-tiered bunks lined both walls, packed so tightly that men had to turn sideways to navigate between them. Crawford was assigned a top bunk near the back, sharing space with 2 other Americans who'd arrived weeks earlier. One was a navigator named Phillips from Ohio, the other a tail gunner called Rodriguez from New Mexico. Both men looked like they'd aged a decade in captivity. That first night, Crawford lay on the thin straw mattress and waited for the hunger to begin its real work. He'd been given a bowl of watery soup and a small piece of black bread that tasted like sawdust mixed with bitter herbs. It was barely enough to coat his stomach. He calculated how long a man could survive on such rations. 6 weeks, maybe 8 if he was lucky and didn't expend much energy. The mathematics of starvation were simple and brutal. But then something strange happened. Around midnight, long after the lights had been extinguished, and the camp had fallen into an uneasy silence broken only by coughs and the occasional cry from a nightmare, Crawford heard footsteps outside. The door creaked open. A flashlight beam swept across the floor and a figure entered, moving with the cautious stealth of someone who knew they were breaking rules. Crawford peered over the edge of his bunk. It was Fisher, the old guard from intake. He carried a burlap sack, and he was moving from bunk to bunk, leaving something at each one. When he reached Crawford's area, he looked up and their eyes met. Fisher pressed a finger to his lips, then reached into his sack and pulled out 2 small potatoes and another piece of bread. He placed them on Crawford's bunk, then moved on without a word. In the morning, Crawford stared at the food, convinced he'd hallucinated the entire encounter. But Phillips and Rodriguez had received the same mysterious delivery. This happens sometimes, Phillips explained in a whisper. Not every night, not even most nights. But some of the guards, the older ones especially, they sneak us extra food. We don't know why, we don't ask. We just eat it and stay quiet. Crawford learned quickly that Stalag VII-A was not the death camp he'd expected. It was something far more complicated, far more human, and in many ways far more heartbreaking. The camp was staffed almost entirely by men who had no business being soldiers. They were too old, too injured, or too broken by years of war to serve on the front lines. Many were veterans of the First World War, called back to duty in Germany's desperate final years. They'd seen their sons and grandsons march off to fight in Russia, in North Africa, in France. Many of those sons and grandsons weren't coming home. These guards were the remnants of a generation that had already lost one war and now found themselves losing another. And somehow, impossibly, many of them had retained their humanity. The official rations at Stalag VII-A were regulated by Geneva Convention standards, but by January 1945, those standards had become a cruel joke. The Third Reich was collapsing. Allied bombing had destroyed supply lines. The German civilian population was starving. The Wehrmacht itself was running out of food. The prisoners should have been the last priority, the first to be sacrificed when resources grew scarce. Instead, Crawford began to notice something extraordinary. The guards were eating less than the prisoners. He'd see them on patrol, these elderly men in uniforms that no longer fit, and he'd notice the way their belts had been cinched tighter, the way their cheekbones had begun to protrude, the way they moved with the careful economy of motion that comes from insufficient calories. They were starving themselves to keep the prisoners alive. One guard in particular caught Crawford's attention. His name was Wilhelm, and he'd been a schoolteacher before the war, a professor of literature and philosophy at a gymnasium in Stuttgart. He was 62 years old, with silver hair and spectacles held together with wire. He walked with a pronounced limp, the result of shrapnel from the First World War that had never been properly removed from his left leg. Wilhelm had a habit of pausing by Building 14 during his evening rounds, ostensibly to check that everything was secure, but really to exchange a few words with the prisoners who gathered near the door. His English was excellent, refined by years of reading British and American literature. In late January, during one of these evening pauses, Wilhelm struck up a conversation with Crawford. "You are educated, yes?" Wilhelm asked, studying Crawford's face with the keen attention of a man who'd spent decades evaluating students. Crawford nodded. "Engineering degree from Penn State." Wilhelm's eyes lit up. "Ah, a practical mind. But do you read?" "Philosophy, literature, a little," Crawford admitted. "Mostly technical manuals these days." Wilhelm smiled sadly. "The war makes technicians of us all, but the soul requires more than technical manuals, Lieutenant. The soul requires beauty, truth, meaning." Over the following weeks, an unlikely friendship developed. Wilhelm would stop by Building 14 after his shifts, and he and Crawford would talk through the door or, when Wilhelm could arrange it, in the small guard room near the compound entrance. They discussed Goethe and Schiller, Kant and Nietzsche. Wilhelm lent Crawford a battered copy of Faust, the pages yellowed and soft from decades of handling. Sometimes Wilhelm would bring small gifts, an extra potato, a piece of sausage so small it was almost insulting, except that Crawford knew it represented a significant sacrifice. Wilhelm was giving away his own rations. One night in early February, during a particularly long conversation, Wilhelm's carefully maintained composure cracked. They'd been discussing Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence, the idea that one should live as if every moment would repeat infinitely. "Would you choose this?" Wilhelm asked suddenly, his voice rough with emotion. "Would you choose this war again? Would you choose to watch your son die again?" Crawford froze. He hadn't known Wilhelm had lost a son. "I'm sorry," Crawford said quietly. Wilhelm removed his spectacles and cleaned them with a handkerchief, his hands shaking. His name was Peter. He was 19. He died at Stalingrad, though I didn't learn this until a year later. The notification simply said missing, presumed dead. For months I hoped. Then I stopped hoping. The silence stretched between them, heavy with shared grief. "My brother died at Guadalcanal," Crawford finally said. "He was 21, Marines." Wilhelm nodded slowly, replacing his spectacles. "Then we are both casualties, Lieutenant. We have both lost what cannot be replaced. This is what war does. It takes the future and burns it for fuel." As February turned to March, the situation at Stalag VII-A deteriorated rapidly. Allied bombing raids intensified. Munich was being pounded into rubble. Supply trains stopped running. The official rations, already inadequate, were cut in half, then cut again. Men began to die, not from brutality or execution, but from simple starvation and disease. The camp hospital, a collection of buildings at the eastern edge of the compound, overflowed with prisoners suffering from dysentery, pneumonia, and malnutrition. And still, impossibly, the guards shared what little they had. Crawford watched Fisher, the old guard from his first day, grow thinner and more frail. The man could barely complete his rounds. One morning, Crawford saw him collapse near the wire fence. Two other guards helped him to his feet, and Crawford heard one of them say in German that Fisher needed to eat something, anything. Fisher shook his head and said something Crawford couldn't quite make out, but the meaning was clear enough. There wasn't enough food for everyone, and Fisher had made his choice about who should receive priority. It wasn't himself. Wilhelm continued his evening visits, though he now moved with obvious difficulty. The limp had worsened, and his face had taken on a grayish pallor. But he still brought his books, still engaged Crawford in philosophical discussions that seemed increasingly surreal given their circumstances. One night, Wilhelm brought a small piece of cheese, no larger than a thumb. He placed it in Crawford's hand with a solemnity that made it feel like a sacred offering. "This was my dinner," Wilhelm said simply. "But I am an old man and you are young. You will survive this war, Lieutenant. You will go home. You will marry, have children, build bridges or buildings or whatever it is that engineers build. You will live the life my Peter cannot. So you must eat." Crawford stared at the cheese, then at Wilhelm. "I can't take this. You will starve." Wilhelm smiled, and there was a strange peace in his expression. "We are all starving, my friend. The question is not whether we will suffer, but whether we will remain human while we suffer. Eating this cheese will not save me, but giving it to you allows me to believe that some small part of Peter's future still exists, carried forward in your survival. Please, do not rob me of this meaning." Crawford ate the cheese, and it tasted like salt and guilt and something he couldn't quite name. Redemption, perhaps, or grace. By April, the end was clearly approaching. The sound of artillery fire could be heard in the distance, a constant rolling thunder that grew louder each day. The guards became increasingly nervous. Some disappeared, simply abandoning their posts and fleeing westward. Others remained, whether from duty, fear of desertion charges, or simple lack of anywhere else to go. Wilhelm stayed. So did Fisher and a handful of others. On April 28th, the American 7th Army arrived. Crawford was in the compound yard when he heard the tanks, the distinctive rumble of Sherman engines that every American soldier knew by heart. The sound triggered something primal in him, a surge of relief so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. They were saved. The liberation of Stalag VII-A was swift and efficient. American soldiers poured through the gates, weapons ready, expecting resistance. They found instead a camp of skeletal prisoners and exhausted guards who offered no fight. The German soldiers were immediately rounded up and forced to kneel in the yard with their hands behind their heads. Crawford stood among the celebrating prisoners, watching the scene unfold, and felt his relief curdle into something more complex. He saw Wilhelm being forced to kneel, the old man's bad leg clearly causing him agony. He saw Fischer, barely conscious, being dragged into line with the other guards. He saw the American soldiers, his liberators, treating these men with the rough contempt reserved for the enemy. And he realized with a sickening clarity that his liberators had no idea what had happened here. To them, these were simply German soldiers, the enemy, complicit in Nazi atrocities. They didn't know about the shared rations, the midnight deliveries of food, the quiet acts of mercy that had kept men alive. They didn't know that these guards had risked court-martial, had starved themselves, had maintained their humanity in the face of a regime that demanded its surrender. Crawford pushed through the crowd of prisoners, ignoring the calls of his fellow Americans. He reached the line of kneeling guards and found Wilhelm. The old man's face was pale, his breathing labored. "Lieutenant Crawford," Wilhelm said softly. "You are free. Go home, build your bridges." An American MP approached, rifle at the ready. "Step back from the prisoner," he ordered. Crawford didn't move. "This man saved my life," he said. "He and the others, they gave us their own food. They kept us alive." The MP looked skeptical. "They're Nazis. They're POWs now. They'll be processed and investigated." Crawford felt panic rising. "You don't understand. They'll be executed. They broke regulations to help us. If the German command finds out, or if there's any kind of tribunal." "He's not a Nazi," Crawford insisted. "He's a schoolteacher. His son died at Stalingrad. He taught me German philosophy. He gave me his dinner." The MP's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "That's not for us to decide, Lieutenant. There are procedures, war crimes investigations. We have to process everyone." Crawford looked at Wilhelm, and the old man gave him a small, sad smile. "It is all right, my friend. Whatever comes, I made my choice. I would make it again. Do not carry guilt for this. You must live. That is enough." The guards were marched away under armed escort. Crawford stood in the yard, surrounded by celebrating prisoners, and felt utterly alone. The liberation he dreamed of for months had arrived, but it tasted like ashes. Over the following days, as the prisoners were processed and prepared for repatriation, Crawford tried desperately to intervene on behalf of Wilhelm and the other guards. He gave statements to American officers, explaining what had happened at Stalag VII-A. He found other prisoners willing to testify about the guards' behavior. He wrote letters to anyone he thought might have authority. Some officers listened sympathetically. Others dismissed his claims as Stockholm Syndrome or misplaced gratitude. The reality was complicated. The American military was processing thousands of German POWs, trying to identify war criminals while managing a massive humanitarian crisis. Individual acts of mercy, however genuine, had to be weighed against the broader context of Nazi atrocities. And there was another problem. By helping prisoners, Wilhelm and the other guards had technically violated German military law. if they were returned to German custody, or if any remaining Nazi authorities learned of their actions, they could indeed face execution for treason or dereliction of duty. The safest option was to keep them in American custody, but that meant treating them as prisoners, potentially for years. Crawford never learned Wilhelm's final fate. In the chaos of the war's end, records were incomplete and contradictory. Some guards from Stalag VII-A were released after brief detentions. Others were held for months or years. A few were transferred to war crimes investigations, though Crawford never heard of any from his camp being convicted. Wilhelm Brandt simply disappeared into the machinery of post-war justice, one old man among millions of displaced persons trying to navigate the ruins of Europe. Crawford returned to the United States in June 1945. He was hospitalized for malnutrition and pneumonia, then sent home to Pennsylvania to recover. He married his sweetheart, a nurse named Dorothy who'd waited for him. He used his GI Bill benefits to complete his engineering degree. He built a career, had 3 children, lived the normal, peaceful life that Wilhelm had insisted he must live. But he never forgot. In his study, Crawford kept a battered copy of Faust, the pages yellowed and soft from decades of handling. On the inside cover, written in careful script, were the words, "To Lieutenant Crawford, may you find your way home. Your friend, Wilhelm Brandt, March 1945. Crawford would sometimes open the book and read passages at random, remembering the old schoolteacher who taught him that humanity could survive even in the darkest circumstances. He'd remember the taste of that small piece of cheese, the weight of sacrifice it represented. He'd remember Fisher collapsing by the wire fence, choosing to starve rather than let prisoners go hungry. He'd remember all the elderly guards who'd risked everything for a simple, radical act, treating their enemies as human beings. The story of Stalag VII-A challenges every simple narrative about World War II. It doesn't fit neatly into categories of good and evil, liberators and oppressors. It exists in the complicated space where individual conscience confronts systemic horror, where ordinary people make extraordinary choices, where mercy survives in the least likely places. Crawford spent the rest of his life trying to tell this story, trying to make people understand that war's moral landscape is more complex than propaganda suggests. He spoke at veterans groups, wrote letters to historians, gave interviews to anyone who would listen. Some people understood. Others accused him of Nazi sympathy or naivety. But Crawford persisted, because he'd made a promise to Wilhelm, an unspoken promise to bear witness, to ensure that those quiet acts of mercy weren't forgotten in the rush to simplify history into digestible narratives. In 1983, Crawford traveled back to Germany for the first time since the war. He visited the site of Stalag VII-A, which had been demolished decades earlier and replaced with residential housing. He stood in a suburban neighborhood that showed no trace of the camp that had once stood there, and he tried to imagine Wilhelm walking these grounds, limping through his evening rounds, carrying his forbidden gifts of food and philosophy. He never found Wilhelm. Inquiries to German records offices produced nothing conclusive. The name Wilhelm Brandt was too common, and the chaos of the war's end had scattered records across multiple archives. Crawford didn't know if the old teacher had survived, if he'd returned to Stuttgart, if he'd lived to see Germany rebuilt and redeemed. He hoped so. He desperately hoped so, but he never knew. Crawford died in 1997 at the age of 76. Among his effects, his children found boxes of documents related to Stalag VII-A, statements from fellow prisoners, copies of letters he'd written to military authorities, and that battered copy of Faust. They found a journal he'd kept, documenting every conversation with Wilhelm he could remember, every detail of those months in captivity. They found evidence of a man who'd spent 50 years trying to repay a debt that could never truly be repaid. The story of Stalag VII-A reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, individuals retain the capacity for choice. Wilhelm Brandt and the other guards could have simply followed orders, could have let the prisoners starve, could have preserved themselves at the expense of their captives. No one would have blamed them. The system they served was evil, but they were small cogs in that machine, elderly men with no real power just trying to survive. Instead, they chose mercy. They chose to see their enemies as human beings. They chose to sacrifice their own meager rations to keep strangers alive. And in doing so, they created a moral complexity that Crawford spent the rest of his life trying to articulate. Because here's the uncomfortable truth that Crawford's story forces us to confront. The man who saved your life can still be part of an evil system. The enemy soldier can still be a good person. Liberation can create new moral dilemmas even as it resolves old ones. And sometimes the people we're taught to hate are the same people who show us the deepest humanity. Crawford's impossible moment, watching his liberators arrest the men who had saved his life, represents a fundamental paradox of war. Justice demands that German soldiers be held accountable. Mercy demands that individual acts of kindness be recognized and rewarded. But war rarely allows for such nuance. The machinery of military justice, necessary as it is, cannot easily accommodate stories like Wilhelm's. And so men like Crawford are left to carry the weight of that complexity, to live with the knowledge that their survival came at a cost they can never fully repay, to bear witness to acts of grace that history might otherwise forget. In the end, Crawford did what Wilhelm asked. He lived. He built his bridges, raised his children, created a life that honored the sacrifice of that small piece of cheese. But he also did something more. He refused to let the story be simplified. He insisted on the complexity, on the humanity of his captors, on the reality that even in the Third Reich's final, desperate days, individual people could still choose mercy over cruelty. That insistence, that refusal to accept easy narratives, might be Crawford's greatest legacy. Because if we can hold the complexity of Stalag VII-A in our minds, if we can acknowledge that Wilhelm Brandt was both a German soldier and a man of profound decency, if we can recognize that liberation and tragedy can coexist in the same moment, then maybe we can approach our own moral choices with greater humility and nuance. Maybe we can recognize that humanity persists even in the darkest circumstances, and that our obligation is not to simplify the past, but to learn from its complications. Wilhelm Brandt, wherever he ended up, whatever became of him, left a legacy in the life of James Crawford. And through Crawford's stubborn insistence on telling this story, Wilhelm's legacy extends to us. It asks us to remember that war is fought by individual human beings, each with their own capacity for choice, each carrying their own griefs and hopes. It asks us to hold space for moral complexity, to resist the urge to flatten history into simple narratives of good versus evil. And it asks us to honor the quiet acts of mercy that happen in war's shadows, the moments when people choose humanity over hate, even when that choice costs them everything. That's the real story of Stalag VII-A. Not a story of American triumph or German villainy, but a story of human beings finding ways to remain human in circumstances designed to strip humanity away. It's a story that doesn't fit neatly into our preferred narratives about World War II, and that's precisely why it matters. Because the truth is always more complicated than the legend, and the complications are where we find our deepest lessons about who we are and who we might choose to become.